Welcome to the podcast where we challenge conventional thinking and explore fresh, forward-looking perspectives on leadership. Whether you're a seasoned executive or an aspiring leader, join us on a journey to uncover the complexities of modern leadership. Because leadership itself may not change, but the way we think about it is constantly evolving. This is Rethinking Leadership, a podcast by TIAS Business School, hosted by Executive Professor Roemer Visser.
Today's guest is Barry Johnson. Barry created the first polarity map and set of principles back in 1975, that is 50 years ago. Since then, he's been learning and applying polarity thinking with people and organizations all over the world. As chairman of Polarity Partnerships, LLC, he continues to explore and promote supplementing or thinking with and thinking to enhance our quality of life on the planet. Barry's newest publication and Volume 1 Foundations and Volume 2 Applications represent what he and his colleagues have learned about and thinking since his first book, Polarity Management, came out in 1992. And for those of you viewing this on YouTube, here's that book. Barry, I'm so excited to say welcome to you in this show.
It's good to be here.
It's a great privilege to talk with you. When you have this sort of vast experience and depth of knowledge after more than really 50 years of working with polarities. Obviously, you're in it so deep that it's in your pores, the pores of every system. And still, I almost hate to ask you this, but for the listener for whom the term polarity is new, can you kind of give an introduction to kind of set the stage for what this thing is that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So polarities are the smallest element of essentially our universal interdependence. So for me, that divine unconditional love is manifest in our universal interdependence. And I'm talking about everyone and everything is interdependent. And the smallest element of our interdependence is an interdependence between two. So the polarity is about the smallest, if you will, interdependent, which is the interdependent pair. And that interdependent pair, which I call a polarity, it shows up within ourselves, and it shows up, in our brain, our left and right hemisphere, and it shows up in thoughts about leadership, like wanting to be both self-assured and humble. Mm-hmm. But with all polarities, we connect the two with and, because the message is we need to have this and this. We need to inhale and exhale, for example.
Gotcha. Well, of course, we can't do that at the same time, right? If we take breathing as a metaphor, it's yes. Like we always have to choose either or.
Well, over time, in one sense, yes, in the moment, we're choosing to inhale or exhale, but with the knowledge that when we inhale, in the future, we will exhale. So because inhaling is dependent on exhaling. And so there's that ongoing dimension, and it just cascades from there. So for example, when we inhale, we take in oxygen. When we exhale, we give out carbon dioxide. Now that's not sustainable unless there's something else in the universe that is taking in our carbon dioxide and giving us oxygen. So we're in relationship with trees because they're, if you will, inhaling our carbon dioxide and trees are exhaling oxygen for us. So not only is there the polarity of me inhaling and exhaling, there's also the polarity of my relationship with trees because what I'm giving, they're taking, and it's reciprocal.
Gotcha. It sounds like it's kind of a systems thinking kind of perspective. Is that fair to say?
Yes. It's a system. It's an energy system that operates in predictable ways. Yeah.
So an energy system sounds a little abstract. Can you? I mean, breathing is of course a great example, but can you come up with an example of how polarity, how this breathing and this in and out shows up, for example, in corporate life?
Sure. So in all organizations, one fundamental polarity is between stability and change. And so the way that the best model we have right now for explaining how the polarities work is the shape of an infinity loop. Infinity loop wraps around both poles of the polarity, and as it wraps around in between them, when it crosses between them, it separates the two poles. So change and stability are not the same thing, right? But it wraps around the outside of them, holding them together. So they come as an interdependent pair. So if you have some people in the organization who want to make a change, for example, we've been highly centralized, and there's more and more of a sense of this is too bureaucratic. We need to create more spontaneity, more responsiveness to the company. We need to decentralize. The point here is that they're experiencing the limits of centralization alone with a historic emphasis on centralized coordination. And they're saying, we need to shift and we need to decentralize. Now, when you shift from the downside of centralization to the upside to get the benefits of decentralization, it is a necessary self-correction in this ongoing infinity loop. So you're making this self-correction, but it's not, the decentralization is not sustainable over time, and you start to then experience the limits of decentralization, which is a lack of coordination, silos, isolation of the business units, etc. And so what happens is now we're shifting back to centralize to regain that coordination. So with all polarities, over time, you're going to end up oscillating. That energy is going to flow between and around and between these two poles. And the objective, if you are aware that you have a polarity, as distinct from a problem you can solve, what you do is you say, well, okay, since we're going to have to both centralize and decentralize, how do we maximize the benefits of each and minimize the downside limitations of centralization to the neglect of decentralization or decentralization to the neglect of centralization?
Yeah. So again, for the listener, what you described in words, and we have to stick with words because most people are going to be listening to this on Spotify or Apple iTunes, is you've kind of described the key elements of the polarity map, which was referenced in the introduction. That is literally it's on a piece of paper. You can literally map out visually how polarities work. So you have 4 quadrants, and so you have the 2 top quadrants and the 2 bottom quadrants. And there are 2 poles. Now, each pole has 1 top quadrant and a bottom quadrant. I'm trying to get the listener to visualize this.
So I'm going to ask, since a lot of people won't be seeing this, I'm going to ask people to just try this physically. And so what people can do is, I'd like you to just close your eyes and put your finger, your index finger of either hand, your right or left hand, whichever is more comfortable, put it right at the bridge of your nose between your 2 eyes.
Yeah.
And what I'd like you to do now is we're going to end up following the skeleton of our eye sockets. So if you go, start off with your finger in the bridge of your nose, and then I want you to go to your eyebrow. Follow your skeleton, the upside above your eye, then follow the skeleton around to your cheekbone, the right cheekbone, back up to the middle at the center of your nose. Now continue moving up to your left eyebrow. Follow your skeleton structure of your eye socket. Keep following it around to your left cheek and back to the middle between your nose. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have you inhale and exhale following this infinity loop, because the infinity loop is the heart of this, the heart of all polarities. So as you inhale and go to your upper right eyebrow, follow to your right cheek. Now exhale by going to your left eyebrow and then go down to your left cheek, and now inhale again. So you inhale. And just follow your own inhaling and exhaling and move around that socket and just follow that infinity loop a few times. Now, if you keep your eyes closed, I want you to go back to the center of your nose here. And so I'd like you to imagine that when we just talked about centralization and decentralization, I'd like you to imagine that your right eye is centralization and your left eye is decentralization. So if you go to your right eyebrow, swing to your right eyebrow. So here you're getting the benefits of centralization, as you just mentioned, which is great. You get system-wide coordination and integration and efficiencies. If you just focus, however, on centralization to the neglect of decentralization, follow your skeleton down to your right cheek. Now what you have is you have the downside of centralization that occurs when you neglect decentralization. So you get too bureaucratic, lack of spontaneity, etc. When you experience that downside on your right cheek, you're going to cross over the bridge of your nose to the upper left eyebrow, go to the left eyebrow, and now you're getting those benefits of decentralization. You're spontaneous, you're more responsive, parts can take initiative, and that's just wonderful. So you get that benefit. Now circle down to your left cheek. The downside of decentralization without centralization is you have silos, excess competition, and a lack of integration of the system. And that, notice, now what that forces you to do essentially is to go up to the bridge of your nose and go up to the upper right eyebrow again. So this process this infinity loop is the engine that drives all polarities. And so it's much more important than the map itself, is the engine. The map is just actually sectioning off sections of that infinity loop. There's an upside and a downside. So if you have a polarity, there will be two upsides. And over time, you will need both upsides. And there will be two downsides. And so what you'd want to do, if you have a polarity, the first thing you need to do with polarities, if you're experiencing a tension, polarities show up as tensions in the system. And so when you experience tension in the system, the first question is, might this be a polarity? If it is, it will have two upsides and two downsides. And our objective will be to try to maximize both upsides and minimize both downsides. And that will serve us well, whatever the polarity is, whether that's a personal polarity or a national polarity or an international polarity. It doesn't matter. It works the same regardless of size.
Got it. Yeah, very, very clear. Thank you for that. And as you were sort of guiding me also around the eye, and especially around central decentral, I was smiling because I have the privilege of getting looks into many different kitchens in terms of organizations. And there's one company that I've worked with. It's sort of an acquisition machine, right? They're very good at acquiring companies and really, really good at keeping those original founders on board. And so they pride themselves on being decentral, on being responsive, entrepreneurial. Their head office is very, very, very low key. So they don't really have the power, so to speak.
Yeah.
But a fascinating example they told me was one of their operating companies lost $1 million client to one of the other operating companies that bid for $700,000. And they didn't even know that they were competing with each other.
Yeah, and so if they would see it as a polarity, they could easily map how do we make sure we maximize our centralization and our decentralization? And the other thing is, how would we know early that we have over-focused on decentralization? So before we lose, a contract with competing with ourselves, before that happens, what would be early warnings that would let us know that we're over-focusing on our decentralization for all the great reasons that you go to decentralization?
Yeah. And so part of it I'm hearing is it needs to be able to breathe, and you need to sort of jump to the other direction just in time. That's the art, really. Part of it is getting clear on what the polarity is, what the infinity loop is.
Right. And the other thing is, what causes you to shift from one pole to the other? And the answer is, it's either the experiencing or the anticipation of the downside of one pole causes us to shift to the other. So for example, another polarity that all of us deal with who have a working life, And that is that we're trying to take care of doing a good job at responsible to our work life, and we're trying to have a life that is beyond work, with home, with family, with friends, and with relaxation and enjoyment. So how do we leverage that and get the upsides of both? And one of the things that we can do is we can build in some vacation time. We can build in a day or two off a week. And what we're doing there is we're anticipating that if we don't take those 1 or 2 days off a week, or if we don't take a vacation, then we're going to find ourselves in the downside of over-focusing on work to the neglect of home.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to get yourself in trouble in the downside of one pole before you shift to the upside of the other pole. You can actually build in a strategic planning in which allows you to essentially make that shift in anticipation. If we don't shift, we're going to get ourselves in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really like this example of work-life balance, because I don't want to overgeneralize, but very often what you see is that we sort of put some pretty rigid fences around these boundaries. You know, I only work 38 or 45 or whatever it is hours a week. And outside of that, you know, I'm tapped out and I'm going home. And I understand what the intent is, but at the same time, you're introducing a certain rigidity that doesn't allow the flexing and the breathing. Would you agree with that?
Yes, exactly. And so once you understand that it is a polarity, then you can adjust to your circumstances. And you might, for a particular period of time, you might decide, no, we really need to have all hands on deck here because, you know, the internal and external realities cause us to need to focus on this pole. So you can easily choose to do that. You just know that over time, you're going to have to take care of this other pole. So just to use the breathing metaphor, if you're snorkeling in 10 foot of water in the Caribbean and you see a starfish at the bottom and you can see it down there, you can change your inhaling and exhaling pattern significantly. You can take a deep breath and surface dive down and get really close to the starfish and take a look at it. Now you've altered your regular breathing pattern, right? But you are aware that when you need to take, you're going to have to inhale sometime in the future, relatively soon. And by that time, you had better be back to the surface.
Oh, it's a beautiful example.
Right? So it's like, and so once you know you've got a polarity, you have all sorts of potential to respond to it depending upon the circumstances. And it's not that you spend the same amount of time on each pole or the same amount of energy. You just need to spend the adequate amount of time and energy to get its benefits. So it may be time-wise, it may be an 8-to-1 ratio.
Nice. Oh, I love this nuance, because typically what people, sort of conclude for themselves that balance over time means that over time it needs to be about 50-50 on average.
Yeah. And so
you're saying no.
Yeah. Yeah. So I work out to try to keep myself in relatively good physical shape. So I spend about an hour a day doing that. I don't spend 24 hours a day trying to do that, but an hour a day. And I'll do 5 or 6 days a week. But I've got that flexibility. I know I need to work. I want to work out. I need to work out a certain amount of time, but it is a minor part of my total time, but it's enough to keep me healthy. I'm fortunate. I'm 83 and I'm still, able to work out in ways that help me feel good. I've got, it's a diminishing process, however. So I can't do the things now in my workouts that I used to do 30 years ago. But I think one of the things that helps us sustain our lives is we do what we can as best we can, as long as we can. And that's diminishing. So 20 years from now, I think I'll still be working out, but it won't look like what it's working out today. I'll tell you that.
Well, we'll definitely ask you to come back to this podcast 20 years from now.
Okay.
So just to kind of put a finer, maybe even clearer tip on what you were saying, you haven't said it, but I think it's important to mention this. You make a distinction between solving problems and managing polarities, right? You make a very clear distinction between those two. And those are two very, very different games to play, so to speak. And obviously, tensions are uncomfortable. They're unwanted. We don't like feeling that tension. And we tend to want to solve that. And your key message here is stop that because they are unsolvable.
Well, yes, it's an important clarification here, and that is that solving problems and leveraging polarities is itself a polarity. So we're not talking about letting go of problem solving in order as if both and thinking and leveraging polarities is more valuable, more important than solving problems. That's not true. As a matter of fact, one of the quotes I like to give in relation to this is that the rejection of either or thinking is an example of either or thinking. So what we need to do is we need to both continue to use our basic problem-solving skills, and we need to supplement it to leveraging polarities, which is a supplemental skill, when that is required. And when it's foolish to use it when it's not required. So with either or thinking and both and thinking, since they're a polarity, each have something positive to bring to our lives, and each without the other becomes dysfunctional. So when we use both and thinking when either or thinking is required, we also get ourselves into trouble. So that's important.
Yeah. Thank you. So for the listener who's thinking, wow, I've never really heard of this, but I sort of recognize this. I see these tensions, central, decentral, stability and change. I can imagine then the question pops up. So, okay, I've got this challenge or this tension or this something I want to solve. How do I know if it's a problem or a polarity? Where do I even start with that, making that distinction?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of questions you can ask. The first one is this tension that I'm experiencing, is it ongoing, like inhaling and exhaling? Is it ongoing? And so I can say now, is it likely that we will have some version of this tension 10 years from now? For example, paying attention to employee interests and company interests. We need to pay attention to both. So 10 years from now, will we be still dealing with the need to pay attention to employee interests and company? Well, the answer is as long as you've got a company, you'll need to pay attention to employee interests and company interests. And so that is one answer to the question, is it ongoing?
Yeah.
The other question is, over time, if I focus on one pole, over time, will I be required to pay attention to the other pole? Because I can focus on inhaling for a while, but over time, I'm going to have to include exhaling. And since the cycle time is so short, it's pretty obvious with inhaling and exhaling. Or activity and rest, we got it's kind of like a 24-hour cycle, So those are the two questions. Is it ongoing? And over time, am I going to be required to focus on the other pole? And you do your best to determine that. And that allows that if you think it is true, then you can create a polarity map. And you can say, well, if the polarity is going to be two upsides and two downsides, and you can start to build a map. And then once you look at that map, there's another question you can ask, and that is, within the polarity map, there's a greater purpose at the top, which responds to the question, why bother? Why bother to do both poles? And that greater purpose, once you have created a polarity map, you've got, okay, I've got some upsides, I've got some downsides, and my greater purpose is to have a quality of life or whatever that is. And the question now becomes, will I be required to pay attention to both of these poles in order to gain that higher purpose? And so all of those, once you've got a map, you can use that as another quality checks or in-process quality control.
Yeah.
And that helps you determine whether you've got a polarity or not.
Got it. Thank you. Are there any examples that come to mind of organizations who may or may not remain confidential, but examples of where the introduction of polarity thinking has made a meaningful difference to organizational performance?
Yes, I write about one of those organizations. It's a really large organization. It's located in 46 countries, multinational organization. And I had done some work with within that organization, and they were having a gathering of their top 200, a little bit over 200 people were coming from around the world to a meeting at their corporate headquarters here in the United States. And they invited me to spend a half a day with them. They were coming for a 4-day. It was a combination of acknowledgement of it was celebration of what the company had been doing, and recognizing some key people at this time who were getting awards for the contribution they'd made to their global company. And they also wanted to have some educational pieces and sort of leadership development pieces. So I was invited to provide a half a day of their 4 days to introduce Polarity Thinking, who many of them did not know about it. Some parts of the organization did, but hadn't been essentially brought to the whole organization. And in the phone conversation that I had with them in anticipation of coming there a few months later, on the phone call was the chief operating officer, the design leader for the organization, and let me see, chief operating officer, the head of the design team, and the chief information officer. So the three of them were on the call, and they wanted to talk about what I might cover in this 4 hours that I had. And they were letting me know who else was coming as resources. It was a big deal for them. Yeah. And so they said, Barry, we want you to understand the theme. Our theme is leading through values. And I said, well, that's just terrific, because it's going to fit with Polarity Thinking, because on a polarity map, you have two values that are both important, and you have two upsides, and those are our values. And so I said, we're going to look at leadership development, we can look at organization development, and we can look through a polarity lens, and the focus can be on values. And the chief operating officer said, well, wait a minute, are you saying that values come in pairs? And I said, yes, I think they do. I said, this is often the case. And I said, so when I work with an organization, if it's just starting up, I just encourage them, when they're thinking about their values, to pay attention to value pairs. And so the response was, wait a minute, if you're going to be messing with our values in front of our top 200 people, we want to know what you do with them. And to show you how long ago this was, he said, do you have a fax machine? And I said, yes, sir, I've got a fax machine. So he said, well, we're going to send you our list of values right now because I want to know what you would do with our values. And I said, okay. Yeah. So the fax machine, blurted out this page. It had a few values. It was somewhere, around 6 or so values that were identified. So I'm looking at the values list. And one of the items was autonomous business units. Strong value, right? Now, if you're located in 46 countries, you need some autonomy for your business units. It's different in China than it is in Brazil, than it is in the United States, than it is in France, right? So you need to be responsive to that local issue and to empower people to do what they need to do in that culture, in that time frame, right? So, and they just loved having autonomous business units. They had nothing about coordination, centralized, the integration. None of that showed up in their values list. And I pointed that out to them. And I said, I noticed there's nothing about, coordination of these business units or integration and collaboration. And it was obvious that nothing like that was there. So they said, so what's your point? And I said, your organization is experiencing or will experience the following dysfunctions. And so if they overfocus on decentralization to the neglect of centralization, to autonomous business units, to the neglect of integrated business units, what kinds of things would show up, do you think, Roemer?
Cost overruns. Yeah. Opportunity costs, inefficiencies. Yeah. Probably some irritation and some internal sort of dysfunctional competition as well. Yep, exactly. So there's a list that's available, and probably anybody who's hearing this or seeing this could come up with a list, because there's a general downside to over-focusing on autonomous business units to the neglect of integration of those business units. So the things you described, excess competition, silos, isolation,
dysfunctionality. I said these kinds of things are going to be a problem. If they're not a problem right now, they're going to be a problem sometime in the future. And it's a vulnerability, not because there's anything against the integrated, the autonomous business units, but there is something missing here that is going to cause you trouble. I said, at some point, you're going to bring your business unit heads together. You're going to identify this as a problem. We got silos, right? And isolation. And so when you bring your business units together, you're going to agree that what you need to do is become more collaborative, more integration of the system. Let's move towards more system-wide integration for all the economies of scale, for all the good reasons, right? On our polarity map now, this would be moving from the downside of one pole to the upside of the other as a necessary self-correction. So I said, the only problem is that then you're not going to go there. Now there's silence on the other line of this phone, right? And so I wait a few seconds, there's just nothing coming. And I said, hello? And the chief operating officer comes back with a very angry voice and he says, who have you been talking to?
Oh, wow.
And I said, I haven't been talking with anybody, but I said, I understand how values work and how polarities work. And so this is a fairly predictable thing. And he said, I want to know how the expletive you knew that we weren't going to walk our talk, because 2 years ago, I held that meeting right here. And we have been trying to move towards an integration of our business units for 2 years. And we are hardly making any progress. And this has been extremely frustrating. And I want to know how you knew we weren't going to walk our talk, because we all agreed to do it. And I said, well, that supplies us with a great focus for when I'm going to be with you in 2 months. We can just take a look at about that reality and how to deal with it. And so that's what we did when we got together. And we sort of designed that with them. What we did was we had 200 people in the room in table groups of 6. And we had autonomous business units and integrated business units as the 2 pole names. And we had every table group just generate what would be the upsides of having autonomy, what would be the upsides of having integration, and then what would be the downsides of focusing on either of them, right? And obviously, all of the maps, you had all these tables, they all had the same content, right? This is another thing, they all very uniform. So there was no question that there was an upside and a downside to each, and they all had the same content for the upside and downside to each. So it was just mass agreement. So then we said, okay, given this is a polarity, the question is now, how do we get the upside of both? And we start with the upside of autonomous business units. So, because the normal arrangement would be, if you're in the downside of autonomous business units and you want to move towards integrated business units, they are likely to use gap analysis, which is the typical change platform, right? What's wrong with the present state? What's the preferred future? And how do we bridge the gap from the dysfunctional present state to the more functional or idealized future state? On a polarity map, that's one diagonal, going from the downside of one pole to the upside of the other. It would be seen as a problem with a solution, but it's more helpful to see it as a part of an ongoing oscillation, a necessary self-correction in an ongoing infinity loop. And they're in the downside of the loop on one side. We need to go to the upside of the other pole, but it's not a solution because it will have its own downside. So once they generated the content of the map, they could see both upsides and downsides. Once we had all the ways that we were going to hold on to the autonomy of our business units, protect that, then they were able to say, okay, if we've guaranteed that we're holding on to our autonomy and these are all the ways we know we're going to hold on to it, now we can have a conversation. Psychologically, we are able to now have a conversation about how we can also provide integration for those business units. And so they moved forward off from that day and are in an ongoing basis. By the way, this company was, as old as the fax machine, but they are still around today, and they are still leveraging the polarity, autonomous business units and integrated business units, because it's a polarity. It's going to be with them as long as they're around as a company.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example. And what I really like about it is it seems that your starting point for the conversation was to reassure them that they can keep what's important to them.
Yes, there's a paradoxical change model. So paradoxically, if you want to move from a pole that you've been focused on to the other pole, and you experience resistance, that resistance is coming from people who they're coming at it with an either or mindset. Are we going to have autonomous business units, or are we going to have integrated business units? And when they see it as an either or proposition, they're going to be afraid that we're moving towards this integrated business units. It's going to lead to bureaucracy, red tape. We're going to lose our spontaneity. We're going to lose all the great things, all the reasons we have this as a value. We're going to lose if we go to integrated business units. So paradoxically, if you want to move from autonomous business units to integrated business units, first affirm that we're going to hold on to autonomous business units and be very explicit about how we're going to do that. So that gives you a platform to hold on to now explore this rather scary space about trying to avoid bureaucracy, but somehow get some integration of this business unit.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of a quote, and I wish I remember who said it. It's one of these scholars, famous scholars, but something along the lines of every change hinges around stability.
Yes. Yeah. If you want to be really good at change, be really good at stability.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. If you focus on one pole of a polarity to the neglect of the other, first you get the downside of the pole that you are emphasizing. Yeah. Then you get the downside of the other pole, which is what you were afraid of when you hold on to that pole. And so we always end up getting the downside. For example, if we use activity and rest as an example of this, right? Yeah. So activity and rest is a polarity, by the way, that all of us have. And like all polarities, we live in them. So you can't go someplace and decide, well, I'm wondering if I want to do activity and rest. No, you're wherever you're going, you're in some version of it, right? So we're inside this polarity of activity and rest. All of us have it available, but not a lot of us, most of us, can't run a marathon. If you want to run a marathon, you have to intentionally leverage the polarity of activity and rest. Right? Yeah. So this is the thing about polarities. They're energy systems that you can leverage to do exceptional things because there's energy within that thing that can lift you towards. So the greater purpose in this case would be, I want to run a marathon. So if I want to run a marathon, what I have to do is I have to get on a regular schedule of running further each workout day. Say I've got 6 months to get myself up to 26.2 miles, right? To be able to run a marathon. So in that process, in how do I maximize the upside of the activity pole of activity and rest is I run further each workout day. So that's a plan. That's an action to get the upside of that pole. So to increase my endurance. I'm going to increase my endurance. So, but what I'm aware of is that I can't just take off and run too far a distance, or I'll hurt myself, right? So I've got to work my way up. I'm further and further each workout day. On the other side, I need to give myself adequate rest because the muscles actually build on the rest part of the cycle. So I need to have activity and rest. Work out, give myself enough downtime so the muscles can recover from the strain of the running further. Now, since it is a polarity, there'll be an upside. Two upsides are my muscles build and I increase my endurance. Those are the two upsides. If I over-focus on increasing my endurance to the neglect of taking care of muscle build, I'll get muscle injury. Yeah. Right? So if I over-focus, by the way, on rest to the neglect of activity, I'll get muscle atrophy. So I'm going to get muscle injury or muscle atrophy depending upon, so there's two clear downsides, right? So my son, Tim, has qualified multiple times for the Boston Marathon. But in one of the times when he qualified, he qualified in Detroit, so he had access, right? So, but between the Detroit and the Boston Marathon, he decides, I want to reduce my time even further. He pushed himself too hard. He over-focused on that activity pole, trying to increase his endurance to the neglect of getting him adequate downtime. So what happened was he ended up with shin fractures. So he not only did he not get to the Boston Marathon, he finds himself in the downside of the rest pole, which is laid up in bed with muscle atrophy happening, right?
Yeah.
So now how did he get to the downside? How did he become a couch potato, which is the last thing this man wants in his life? How did he get there? He overfocused on activity to the neglect of rest. First, he got the downside of overfocusing activity, which is muscle injury. Then he found himself in bed and he got the downside of that pole as well. So with all polarities, some people think, well, we want to centralize and at least we get the benefits of, we want to centralize, we get the benefits of centralization and at least we get that. But in fact, you don't get it. You centralize too long, you'll get the downside of centralization and then you get the downside of decentralization as well. So that becomes the demise of systems. And hopefully I'm brought in to work with organizations before they get to that point. But I've been in a number of systems in which when we look at key underlying polarities, they are aware that they're in the downside of both. And historically, I can just ask them, well, which pole did you overfocus on to such an extent to the neglect of the other that got you in the downsides of both? And they can answer it. They can answer. Yeah. They look at their history and they can say, "Oh yeah, we overfocused on this pole and it got ourselves in trouble."
Yeah. Well, here's a classic example: is exploration and exploitation, or innovation and operational excellence, right?
Yeah. Yes. As a matter of fact, I've got a fun story about that. I was invited to Harvard to their to LILA, their Learning Innovations Lab, and they were focusing on paradox or polarity. For a number of sessions, and they have organizations come from around the world, usually in teams of 2, 3, maybe 4 people. As a team from the organization, they come and they spend about 4 days, 3 or 4 days at Harvard, and they have 4 sessions once a quarter. So it's a year-long program. And I was invited in as a resource for the final session of their group and introducing polarity thinking. And I did that with a focus on complex adaptive systems. I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who wrote a wonderful book on complex adaptive systems. But both of us were invited to come in, and in her book, she was talking about the process that organizations go through, where when they're starting up, they are often very entrepreneurial. And so if you have entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial leadership and administrative leadership were the 2 poles that she talked about. And she was saying every organization starts on an entrepreneurial bent, essentially, right? So we get all the benefits of entrepreneurship. But if you focus on entrepreneurship, that energy, which is it's very creative, very energetic, like what you were just talking about, they experience the limits of entrepreneurship, and you need to now the reason that most startups, a high percentage of startups fail is because they maintain the entrepreneurial spirit, but don't have the administrative capability to maximize what they've already got, right? And to maintain it and get some regular things in pattern and unified arrangements. So they end up often hiring somebody who comes in as a new CEO to take over the company who's got administrative skills. So they've got this strong administrative base. Now, but the strong administrative base, if you overfocus on that, you lose that whole entrepreneurial initiative and that great energy, that great startup energy. And so we built a polarity map, and there were about 54 people in the room, and we put the infinity loop on the floor, and we walked through, and we together generated the upsides and downsides of this polarity map. Now, I then asked them, I said, okay, so what I'd like you to do now is put yourself on the infinity loop. The infinity loop is a timeline, right? So you kind of oscillate through this over time. So where would you put your organization? Where would you be on the loop? Every organization, the names of which will be, seal my lips. But every organization, I think there were about 28 or something like that organizations there. Every organization went to the downside of administrative leadership. And as a group, now talk about simple research. This is no accident. All over the world, large companies, some small companies, but mostly really large companies. And they're all sitting down there. And I said, so now I understand why you're at the Learning Innovations Lab, because your desire is to move from being in the downside of administrative leadership to re-access that entrepreneurial initiative and spirit that started up when your organizations were founded, right? And so that's what we ended up doing then, was looking at, okay, so how do we support you in moving towards regaining that entrepreneurship? And they sometimes call it intrapreneurship, right? So it's like, how do we build that into our organization, that kind of energy? But the first thing we had to talk about together was, how do we hold on to the benefits of administrative leadership? Because the administrators are going to resist the move, because they were brought in to protect the company from a historical downside of being too focused on entrepreneurship. And they were almost ready to bottom out before I came, the administrative leader. I came and saved this company. And now you're telling me you want to go to that entrepreneur stuff, Don't you remember how terrible it was when I came here? So there's these different points of view in the room, but you first needed to hold on to the reason they weren't able to move to the entrepreneurial side was because all the power was in administrative leadership. Right? And the fear was that if we go there again, we'll find ourselves in the downside of which is a legitimate fear. But once you saw it as, wait, we can do good, powerful administrative leadership and entrepreneurial leadership. If we can do both, how would we do that? Now that's the polarity question, right? And that's what they started dealing with, every company that was there.
Yeah. That's another fascinating example. And there's so many examples that you've provided in this conversation. And it seems, hopefully the listener is thinking the same thing I am. It's just, holy moly, this really, I see it, right? How come this hasn't become, as mainstream in our education system, in our public awareness as, let's say, problem solving has become? Why hasn't this caught on like wildfire?
Well, it's a great question. I've been asking some version of it for 50 years because it caught on like wildfire for me when I first saw experienced that infinity loop, and I thought, wow, this would relate to every system size I could imagine. I think what I and others significantly underappreciate is the value and power of either/or thinking and problem solving. It's our de facto base for learning. So, for example, I have a great grandson right now, and his name is Duke. And so I'm watching my grandson and his wife teach him things. And so they're teaching Duke. He's going to be 2 years old in another couple of months. But they've been teaching him, they point to his nose and say, what's this? And he says, nose, right? He can count to 10 in Spanish as well as English, right? So all of this is teaching him language. He's teaching words. So this is a car, this is whatever. All of that is problem solving, right? What is this? So the basic problem solving and the parents get all excited. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. What is this? Yes, good for you. And so there's this applause, this wonderful reward for solving problems. So he's learning 3-4 years before he even gets into school. He's learning about problem solving and learning that if you get the right answer, you get rewarded for it. So the message is, if you've got a question, if you've got a difficulty, what is that? Oh, that's a car. What is that? That's a chair. If you've got a question and you can answer it right, if you can solve it, good things happen to you. Now you get into school and you're learning to write. And so you've got this combination of letters, and you can put these letters in all sorts of combinations, and they spell things that represent what a car is or what a chair is, And so you're learning mathematics, you're learning science, and when you have a test for any of these things, what you want to do is you want to solve the problems in the test as soon as possible. So we are ingrained in, we're hardwired. If I've got a difficulty, I need to solve it.
In fact, that is quite literally how we define intelligence, our ability to solve problems under time pressure.
Yes. Yeah. And so, and that's one pole of a polarity. So there's intellectual intelligence, and there's emotional intelligence, which is a great other polarity. So we were saying, what's missing here? Well, there's emotional intelligence. The other thing then is that we do teach people about polarities to some degree also when they're very young, but we don't use the word polarities. So I can go any place in the world and ask the audience to imagine that they're 2 years old and they're sitting in their home on the floor and they're playing with some toys with some friends of ours. They're kids. Some other friends are come over to play, or it's siblings, but some kids. So your child is playing with some friends and they're getting into an argument over the toys. Now you're 2 years old. What do one of your parents comes into the room, they see the argument and understand, they say, you should learn to what? With your toys, with these kids, you should share. Now, the word share is in every language on the planet, and it is what parents teach their kids at, probably even before they're 2 years old, you need to share. Now, sharing is a polarity concept. It is taking care of yourself and taking care of others. Now, so what's the medium? Well, you need to figure this out, how to somehow both of you have your interests taken care of. So that's a basis that shows up very young, but it's not institutionalized into our learning like hopefully it will be. I have a good friend in the Netherlands who's starting a foundation for teaching polarity thinking to children as a form to build that into education, and hopefully that'll happen. We'll see.
Makes sense. So we do it, but we model it to some extent, but even if we teach it, we don't make it explicit. Everybody recognizes that being in a long-term relationship successfully requires some kind of give and take, taking care of self, taking care of the other. Everybody recognizes that intuitively, immediately. There is nobody who I've come across yet who does not recognize that. But somehow when we end up in the world of work, the world of spreadsheets, the world of KPIs and problems to solve, we sort of throw that overboard or turn that off. At least that's been my sense. And we become these linear problem-solving thinkers, so totally blind to this dynamic of polarities.
Yes. Yeah, that happens. And there are a number of companies, there are a lot of examples all over the world of people who understand the phenomena of our interdependence and do it really well, and they've never heard about polarity thinking or paradigm thinking,
exactly.
right? One of the examples of that was I worked with Natura in Brazil, and a friend of mine had gone down there and introduced them to polarity thinking, and they wanted to have me come down and talk with them. So I was down there, and as the limo that took me from the airport to the front of their main office dropped me off, and they were there. A group of 3 of them were standing there waiting for me to come in, and the woman who was in charge of organization development for Natura was smiling, and she said, "Welcome, Dr. Johnson." And as we were walking then from the car towards the building, she pointed to something written in Portuguese, carved right into the wall, into the concrete wall. She said, "Barry," she said, I want to tell you what this says." And it said, trying to remember the exact quote. It was doing well and being well. And she said, what we mean by doing well is that we're fiscally sound. We're financially sound. We're building a solid fiscal organization, And being well is that we take care of our employees, we take care of our community, and we take care of the environment. So, this doing well and being well was right there. The wonderful dimension of taking care of those two. And she smiled at me and she said, "So." And obviously this is right in their walls when they built their, this building. And she said, "So it seems like we already understand something about polarities." And I just smiled and I said, "Absolutely." So it was really a fun thing. And they wanted to make the polarity lens more explicit. But the founders already knew what they were after. This isn't just about the company doing well. It's about our employees doing well, about the community we sit in doing well, and it's about our overall environment doing well. Very clear. This fits with conscious capitalism, by the way. The whole conscious capitalism movement is about paying attention to shareholders and stakeholders, which includes the whole planet.
Correct. And a lot of the proponents of shareholder capitalism feel like they're under attack and that the message is, I guess we need to just ignore the shareholder. It's bad to be a shareholder and want financial gain, which then leads to some sort of a paralysis, right?
Right. It's a good example of seeing when a polarity is identified. If you see it from an either or mindset, then you're frightened about the going to the other pole and neglecting, in this case, shareholders feeling like you're going to neglect us. And so that's why you have to intentionally at the front end say, let's hold on. It'll enhance shareholder benefits to pay attention to stakeholder benefits as well. Firms of Endearment, that book was written about that reality.
This is probably a really big question, and I know we need to wrap up, but I can't resist the temptation to ask it. Imagine that you had the chance to bring together some of the world's most powerful political leaders, media magnates, CEOs, and given, of course, what we're going through collectively, right? These times with polarization and all the pressure on DEI and other sorts of developments. What is it that you would want to tell them if you had their full attention?
Well, I think the most important message that I would have is that the native peoples and people from our various faith traditions, it doesn't matter which tradition we're talking about, all have one polarity in common that is a part of their contribution to us. And that is the notion that we are all accountable for our actions or our inactions. There's a sense of accountability, and which would be the justice pole of a justice and mercy polarity. And all of us, whether we're talking about an individual person, whether we're talking about a business, or whether we're talking about a nation state, or we're talking about humanity, all of us are much more than our worst behavior. And so we are not defined by our worst behavior. We are more than that. And so in the justice and mercy polarity, we need to pay attention to our impact on other people and hold ourselves accountable and hold others accountable for our actions and for our impact on the planet. And we need to also provide unconditional respect for everyone and everything on the planet. Or in a faith tradition, it would be unconditional love. Divine unconditional love is the necessary supplement to accountability. So justice needs to be supplemented with mercy. And how do we do that? That's a great question. And it is the fundamental question, because if we overfocus on justice to the neglect of mercy, it becomes self-righteous cruelty. If we overfocus on mercy to the neglect of justice, it ends up ignoring or tolerating the injustice that is happening. So it sort of acts as if the injustice weren't happening. And so how do we both recognize injustice when it's happening, but how do we also see those who are like ourselves and others that are involved in that injustice? How do we have some appreciation for the fact that we are more than our worst actions? That would be the fundamental message. And in stating that, I'd be also putting that in the context of it's a polarity. So we have two upsides and downsides, and that would be, there are then underlying polarities that could be paid attention to intentionally in order to enhance our quality of life on the planet.
Wow, that's beautiful. On that note, it's time to bring this to a close. The 2-volume book is called And, Making a Difference by Leveraging Polarity, Paradox, or Dilemma. It's available at Amazon.com. And for those interested in learning more about polarity management, please visit polaritypartnerships.com. Barry, it's been a profound privilege and pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the opportunity very much.